I apologize for not having my webcam on. I would turn it on, but my webcam is not turning on for whatever reason. It did last time. I don't know why it's not this time.
That's all
Weird.
right. I see your profile picture. It's lovely. So
It was taken in Berlin last summer,
back when we could travel.
back when we could travel. I miss
Yeah.
Berlin.
Where are you based, by the way?
I'm in Derry. I'm in Derry, Northern Ireland. So
Oh,
you know,
really? Okay. I've
so
never
you
been.
know-
I really want to go to Northern Ireland. I've been to, Ireland, but
never
not Northern Ireland.
Basically,
lovely.
if you want to know the experience, just watch Derry Girls on something like Netflix or something.
That's on my list. I really want to watch that. It's it's supposed to be good. But yeah, I'll I'll keep that in mind. People
you
would
wanna-
usually say Game of Thrones. Watch Game of Thrones, then you'll see what it looks like. But I guess Dairy Girls better.
If you want to experience my hometown, that's probably the best way to experience it right now. Ragnar Tornquist. What is your favorite game?
My favorite game is Journey. So I got into playing games back in the 80s when you either had one of the many weird consoles or you had a computer. And I guess my first contact with games was probably arcades, like a lot of people back then. But I also remember us having one of those Atari Pong machines that you connected to your telly with an aerial cable, and it had the paddles built in, and you could basically just play variations of Pong-like games. So that was, I think, our first gaming hardware in the house. But, the serious part of, really playing games, that came through various computers that my father bought, like a Sinclair ZX1. That was our first computer. That probably betrays my age. We had an IBM PC as well, but it wasn't really the kind you could do much game playing on. And then we had a weird computer that was a Hong Kong knockoff of an American computer called TSR-80. And that was a computer that I started both sort of seriously playing games on and making games on. And that must have been back in 82, 83. So my sort of game playing journey began at the same time as my game development journey, because we didn't have a lot of games and my parents weren't willing to spend money on a lot of games. They wanted computers to be more tools than toys. So I basically decided I had to teach myself BASIC in order to make games so I could play them. And that's what I did. I think I created probably close to I don't know, 100 games in a few years on that computer, and then moved on to a Commodore 64 a couple of years later, and that's where my game development gave way to more game playing, because on the Commodore 64 you could visit friends' houses and you could bring some blank discs with you, and then things would happen, and you would come home and suddenly you had a lot more games. So at that point, sort of the access to a vast library of games probably pushed my game development skills and abilities to decide. But yeah, I mean, it goes back a long time. We also had a Nintendo system at that point, the NES. So I was lucky in being able to have access to all these things, because my dad was an engineer and he found it interesting himself. And then, you know, being able to tinker with these things and see the inherent possibilities in them.
Can you recall what sort of games you were playing at that time anyway?
There were a lot of, you know, on the Commodore 64, there were a lot of platform puzzle games, action games. But the first games that really started to stick with me was adventure games on the Commodore 64. I got one of those disk drives that had the floppy disks and attached it, and was able to then try my hand on some of the old Infocom text adventures. And they were complex for somebody like me, and also the language was difficult. Not the reading part, but to try to sort of figure out that part of it didn't make any easier for a Norwegian kid to try to decipher those puzzles. But the idea of the adventure fascinated me, the ability to step into a different world, and that was so much more evocative than, you know, the basic action or arcade games. So on the Commodore 64, I got access to a tool called Quill. It was like a text adventure creator that allowed me to make my own adventure games. So it's sort of the idea of an adventure, of being able to experience a story and to interact with the story. That was incredibly fascinating, because I was a storyteller. I loved writing. I loved drawing comic books. I loved the idea of making films. I made Super 8 short films with my brother as the sole actor in them at that point, and games as sort of a storytelling medium. I saw the possibility in those simple adventure games back then. So I played them all. I played everything that was available on the Commodore 64, and then later on the Amiga, the Commodore Amiga, before getting a PC myself in the early 90s, and then playing games like Day of the Tentacle, Gabriel Knight, the first one, all the LucasArts adventure games, of course, and really loving them, and that's where I guess my love of adventures and interactive stories began.
Playing those sorts of adventure games with such deep narrative for its time, do you think that sort of had an influence on the games that you've made now? That sounds like a very obvious question, and probably a very obvious answer.
No, nothing I've ever done influenced my creative works. It all comes out of nothing. No, of course, yeah. Longest Journey was, my first sort of professional adventure game. Even though I had made various text adventures for my own amusement earlier, but The Longest Journey was definitely heavily inspired by Gabriel Knight, by the LucasArts games, by the intricate and interesting puzzles of Day of the Tentacle, but of course a different approach to it. I think definitely the first Gabriel Knight was one of those adventures that made me see the mature possibilities. The fact that it didn't have to have a cartoony art style. It could have mature themes. It could be an adventure game for grown-ups. It wasn't the first to do that, but I think the first Gabriel Knight was special in that it really had adult characters and mature themes, and presented, at least for the time, very well. Very, not cinematically, but more sort of like a whole new approach to adventure games.
And that was the sort of first game that you played that sort of had those sort of adult themes?
Probably not. I mean, the Infocom games, some of them had complexities as well. There was a game called A Mind Forever Voyaging, for example.
Oh, we had Sam Barlow talking about that a few years ago. Yeah.
But those games were maybe a little bit harder to approach, and I played them when I was a lot younger. And when I played Gabriel Knight, I wasn't doing any game development myself at the time. I was sort of studying film and really sort of angling to work in the film industry at that point. But it stuck out as something very interesting, and a sort of I guess it reawakened the idea of why film, why not games? You can do something like this. You can do something that is moving and mature and dark and interesting with games.
I guess in that way, it's probably a good thing that you had those sorts of games as your sort of first sort of mature influence in storytelling in games, because at least then it wasn't Metal Gear Solid 2 like it was for me at 11 years old.
Well, the Metal Gear Solid games are so interesting in terms of doing storytelling in a way that, if you look at it from the perspective of a film or TV or any other medium, they can be quite terrible. But as games, they are fantastic, and it's hard to really understand what makes games such a different medium for telling those kinds of stories, and why does it work there. And I think those games are fascinating because, translating the stories of those games into another medium is probably not a great idea. But as games, they stand out.
How do you think games sort of handle that sort of juxtaposition in a way, like handling a narrative in terms of let me try and rephrase that. Like, how do you think it handles that sort of narrative transition within games?
It's something we're discussing almost on a daily basis, because we're working on a game that's narrative driven, and it's weird and different in many ways. And I think the great thing about games is that it's still a medium that is in its infancy in a lot of ways, at least narrative games. I mean, narrative games have been around for a long time at this point, so I'm not saying that that we're just getting started, but it's still, the technology advances so much compared to film and TV, for example, which are oftentimes quite stagnant or static for a long time. So with games, it's sort of like a constant evolution, and that means that new approaches are accepted and embraced, and storytellers are constantly able to do things that have not been done before. And of course, I mean, you have two tracks. You have the games that try to be traditional storytelling in the AAA sense, with cutscenes and fantastic visual effects and sort of using the filmic or cinematic language. And those are great. Those evolve by themselves, and they evolve in tune with technology. But then you have the different track of sort of the more indie type games, or games that try not to do the cinematic storytelling, but they're trying to sort of invent new ways to tell the story. And that's, I think, where games are way ahead of other media, where there's not that much mainstream acceptance for experimental cinema, for example. I mean, it's hard to even define that. But with games, there's so much experimentation going on, and that bleeds out into the more big budget games and AAA games. So, and that's why I think Metal Gear is interesting. It's sort of experimental storytelling, but with a huge budget. And I think games handle it because game players are accepting, and they are interested in trying new things and experiencing new things. I think people who play games are open-minded in that sense. And because it's married with gameplay, there's a possibility of doing more with narrative that might not work out if the gameplay is solid. You still have a good game. You might have a narrative that doesn't quite work, but it allows for progress and experimentation. And I see that happening so much, and it makes games super interesting. It makes game development, I think, more interesting than working in traditional media. And it creates beautiful failures and the occasional successes that pushes the genre forward. And I don't know, I could easily speak for hours about how I think narrative games are, the place where storytelling is really evolving. And I'm not going to do that here. But yeah, it is super interesting, and it's something that as game developers we're constantly trying to tap into, see what other people are doing, see how games tell stories in ways that we haven't thought of before, and then stealing everything we can and trying to integrate it with our own ideas.
It's funny that you should mention those two tracks of narrative, and I want to pick up on something that you said in relation to your own stuff. I mean, like, from what you're saying, like that second track of what you said about experimentation in storytelling, like that feels like that sort of describes Dustborn in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that describes Dustborn, the game we're working on right now. I think that in my own career, I probably leaned more towards tradition than experimentation. I think the game Longest Journey was in many ways a very traditional adventure games, but perhaps with a story that was a bit untraditional and with a lead character and characters in general that weren't typically seen in games. But in structure and form, it was I wouldn't call safe, but it was traditional. And the same has been the case with both the sequel Dreamfall and even Dreamfall Chapters, although we try to do some new things there, but things that are new to us, not necessarily to the genre or to other developers. The game that I worked on before Dreamfall Chapters, called The Secret World, that was an MMO, and
there you have no idea how much I love The Secret World, like back in the day. It was so good. I enjoyed it.
I'm very proud of that game. I think it was a commercial. It was not a success commercially. Let's just put it that way. And it took a long time to make, and it was very expensive. And it definitely led to Funcom, the developer, changing as a company. But I think we did some super interesting things there, and I think what we tried to do there is to sort of marry the personal narrative with the massively multiplayer genre. That was doing something different. That wasn't sort of just leaning on what was there before. I mean, true, we did use cutscenes and mission briefings from NPCs and things like that, but trying to sort of thematically put that into an MMO, I think that was untraditional. But I mean, I haven't really sort of been a driver for experimental storytelling, I think. But with Dustborn, I think at least we're trying to do something different. We're trying to make the story part of every system of the game. We're trying to sort of make the idea of words having power being part of the combat system. So yeah, I mean, we're definitely trying to push some experimental stuff in there and to do a game that's definitely crazier and far out compared to all the stuff we've done. I was basically a kid, just I just wanted to play games, so I said, okay, I'll just make my own. But I mean, getting into the industry, I'm definitely privileged in every single way there is to be privileged. Being Norwegian, being a white guy, being born at the time I was born, and I stumbled into game development in a way that is almost embarrassing. But I went to film school in the US, in New York City, and my intention was to sort of return to that, or to go into that professionally, to make films, to write screenplays, to direct, to go to Hollywood, basically. But then I found myself back in Norway, and I stumbled across a job ad in a paper newspaper, if you can believe it. Again, showing my age.
Wow, like that's proper old school.
I know. This was in 1994. I had to basically leave America, not because I did anything, but because my visa ran out and I came back home and I was like, okay, I need to do something at least to make money. Opened the newspaper, saw the job ad. I remember there was a picture of Mickey Mouse, and it basically said, "You want to work with Disney and their properties? Call this number." And that was Funcom back then, who was a developer for hire who did games with Disney and other properties and other companies. So I applied for a position as a producer, and a week later, I found myself in Hollywood, in Universal Studios, at the table, talking to the director and producer of the movie Casper, the Friendly Ghost, because Funcom had signed a deal to make a game based on that movie. They'd already locked down a timeline of 9 months. I was basically a producer. I was put in an office back home that basically had nothing except the manuscript of the movie and a timeline and a team that was waiting for somebody to tell them what to do. And that was how I landed in the game industry. Of course, it helped that I had both, played a lot of games. I had made a ton of games myself. I was sort of a self-taught designer, and that I had a film education and a background, so I could sort of straddle the fence when it came to making a game based on a movie. But yeah, that's how I stumbled into it. And then I was basically told, okay, just do what you need to do in order to have a game ready in 9 months. It took 18 months because game development, and because that was crazy. And because we were also making a game for the PlayStation 1. And our instructions and manuals were all in Japanese, and nobody on the team spoke Japanese. And we were making the game also for the 3DO. I don't even know if you've heard of that, but that was a console in the mid-90s. And the Sega Saturn. And nobody on the team had any game development experience. Nobody had any experience with these consoles. We had no idea how to do this. So it was a trial by fire to make this game with an American publisher, and to basically deal with both them and the studio and the director and even the office of Steven Spielberg, that we never spoke to. We did get one fax at one point, and yes, this was back when communication was actually through faxing. Even though we did have email, but I guess in Hollywood they didn't have email yet. But I was told at one point that a joke I'd written for Casper would not be appropriate, and if Steven Spielberg heard about it, he would be furious. So that was my only contact with Steven Spielberg on that game. But yeah, I mean, that's where I started. I was lucky. I started at the top, and we made a game in 18 months that ended up probably selling more than most of the games I've worked on. So I really started at the top. It's been all downhill from there on.
You could say you were falling upwards instead.
Exactly.
And then obviously from Funcom, then you went into you started up Red Fred's Games.
I did. I was at Funcom for 18 years. I loved it, and Funcom was a place where they really embraced and let you basically do whatever you wanted to do, to be honest. I mean, in a good way. I mean, nobody told me what the longest journey needed to be. It was basically just make sure you deliver a game, and we had complete creative freedom. The same with The Secret World to a certain degree. I mean, what we were doing was risky, but we had the support of the organization, of management, and be able to do that. So I was privileged and extremely lucky to work at Funcom. But after 18 years, first off, I mean, you get a niche, you want to move on. Secondly, indie industry was really sort of firing on all cylinders back then. It seemed to be sort of a possibility to actually go and create something new. And I was tired of working with huge teams. The team on The Secret World was at least 250 people. Development happening over 3 or 4 different offices across the world. It felt like in order to do the things I really wanted to do, I had to do it somewhere else. So we started Red Thread Games in 2012, and we were able to then, let's say, borrow or license the property that I'd created, The Longest Journey and Dreamfall, and basically Funcom gave us permission to make another game in that universe, and that was Dreamfall Chapters. And we went on Kickstarter. We got some grant money from the government because socialism, yes. And
that was Creative Europe as well, wasn't it? If I remember right.
No, that was Creative Europe has supported all of our games after Dreamfall Chapters, but
okay.
For Chapters, it was the Norwegian Film Institute that was very generous with their grants. And really helped the development of that game, because Dreamfall Chapters was entirely funded through Kickstarter and grants, and whatever money we got through, selling Dreamfall Chapters and basically putting that back into subsequent episodes and the eventual remaster of the game. So yeah, I mean that was my hope of leaving Funcom and starting Red Thread Games, was to be able to sort of focus on single player narrative games, and to do it with a bunch of people I enjoyed working with, and some of whom had lost their jobs at Funcom after The Secret World finished. And I slipped right into that as well. I mean, it worked out really well. We've had our ups and downs, of course, in the 8 years that Red Thread has been around. We've had work for hire that's been cancelled. We've had our scary times when the revenue does not match the expenditures. But we survived. We've released Dreamfall Chapters, first 5 episodes of that, and then a remaster and console versions. We made Draugen and published that ourselves on consoles as well, and now we're working on Dustborn.
Let's talk of your favorite game, Journey, and I am very excited personally because it now means that my favorite game has finally covered my own actual top 3 episodes, top 3 games rather, in its own rather standalone episodes, even if one of them did come from me as a special.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I'm happy to sort of fill in the final game on that list.
The final gap.
The final gap
until someone actually does Zone of the Enders 2, the second runner next, and then we go top 4. So in terms of we'll get into Journey properly in a second, but I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on what came before Journey from within that game company, especially specifically Flow and Flower. Like, what were your thoughts on them?
I have played Flow, but I cannot remember any of it. I can't even remember what it looked like. So I don't think that game touched and affected me as much as Flower and then of course Journey did. When it came to Flower, I don't know when I played it. I'd like to think I played it before Journey, but it might be a lie. But let's say I did. And Flower, it stuck with me, and I've actually played that game through a couple of times, and just keep in mind, I never replay games. I mean, I never finish games. I play
You're
a
one and
lot of
done.
games. I've never had time to finish games. The games are too long and too big and too complicated. I love starting games, but the list of games I have completed is embarrassingly short, at least in recent decades. But Flower I did. It's short, of course, that helps. It's a good thing. It's also beautiful, and I felt it was a good game. It's not on my sort of top 10 list or even top 20 list of games ever, but it was a unique experience, and it was beautiful. And I love beauty. I love aesthetics. I love the combination of music and audio and animations and colors and beautiful pictures. So, in that sense, the game gripped me. But I think both of those games they were sort of part of the journey to journey. And Journey is sort of the culmination of that. It's a game that sort of stands on the shoulders and far above those other games, I feel.
The road to Journey. There's just so much to talk about Journey. Honestly, we could probably make a 3-part special mini series of Journey if we go 6 hours or so. But I think the first sort of point to sort of touch upon is just how beautiful it looks. I mean, it's very immediate. It grabs you in a way that's very, not enticing, but it just grabs you in a very immediate way and makes you think, wow, this is going to be special. Wow, this is going to be pretty incredible. And I got that feeling immediately, I'll admit. But not in a million years did I think, yeah, this is going to be incredible. Piss off, Microsoft. Sorry, I just got a notice from a thing. But in terms of that sort of look to, like I said, it gives you that sort of grab in terms of, this is going to be pretty special. But not in a million years did I think, holy shit, this is going to be pretty fucking special. Like, this is incredible.
No, I actually, to refresh my memory a bit, I sat down and played it just before our call. So I started it up on the PlayStation 4 in the office, and yeah, it's a striking start with that desert and sort of fading into that, and this red figure sitting in the sand. And I think it looks great now, but I mean, it came out 8 years ago on the PlayStation 3.
8 years ago.
And it looked it looks, of course, better in some ways now, but back then the impression it made was so much greater. And I think maybe people who play it now, they're gonna lose that a bit, although there is a timelessness to the art. It's dark, it's clean, it stands out. The art direction is impeccable. So of course it's not driven. The look of the game is not driven by technology. But there was something starting up that game on the PlayStation 3 back then. And to be honest, there are parts of it that look better in the original PlayStation 3 version. For example, the sand had a sort of a coarse look to it that is almost lost on the PlayStation 4 with the fidelity you have there. And so yeah, it was striking. And then the music, when that kicks in, I think the music is not just half of that game experience. It's 2/3 of it. It's such a big part of it, and that score is still one of my favorite game scores of all time. And I think, yeah, the combination of the striking art and the technology at display and the music made it a memorable experience from the moment you started it.
Just to touch upon those sorts of 2/3 aspect that you mentioned in detail, like, obviously we mentioned the art, and that obviously is down to the direction of Matt Nava, who just recently put out the Pathless, the Giant Squid, Abzu as well, of course. Obviously there's a massive through line there between Journey, Abzu, and Pathless in terms of sort of that direction. Admittedly, I'll admit up front now, I've still yet to play the Pathless, even though it's sitting waiting to be played on my PlayStation 5. And because I am a massive sucker for anything Annapurna puts out anyway. But I guess, yeah, it defines, in terms of journey anyway, it defines a massive part of that game. It's really integral to it.
Yeah, it is. And not, I mean, you have the music, the score, which is of course, it's beautiful and I think very memorable to people. But you also have the way the sounds work in that game when you sort of call out, when you do sort of your little shout,
Your little chirp, yeah.
and yeah, chirp, yeah, and that how that's sort of in tune with the music and how all that sort of plays together into sort of a symphony of images and sound, if you will. But everything in that game, I think that speaks to sort of how long they spent on it and how much they tended to that garden, so to speak, and pulled out the stuff that was unnecessary. How sort of focused it all is, and that's evident from the moment you started up, where there's no main menu, there's no sort of intro screen, there's no press start to play. I think it really helped them to have to be a game published by Sony. I think a lot of the stuff they did, third-party developers or sort of other companies would not have been allowed to do. They did things that sort of broke conventions and broke the rules, and that really helped them. But I think to Sony's credit, they were able to see that and basically say, look, we're going to let you do these things because we can see it, we can feel it. So I think, Sony sort of championing that game and helping it bring it to their platform, I think that's a part of it too. But yeah, I mean, you're right. There's so much memorable in terms of the aesthetics of that game and how they all pull together.
From your interpretation, how important was it for Journey to sort of have that creative freedom, like you say, that game company sort of had? Like, obviously it helps that they had the backing of Sony. They had the sort of incubation that they had with Sony Santa Monica. But like, even then, like, how important was it just for Sony to give such a small team as much creative freedom as, say, the likes of, their AAA studios like Naughty Dog, like Sony Santa Monica, like Sucker Punch, etc.?
I mean, it's incredibly important, and that's not sort of minimizing the work of the development team. Of course not. It's all their accomplishment, but the fact is, if they had a different publisher, maybe not a first-party publisher, I'm sure that would have hurt the game. They might not have been able to do all the things they wanted to do technically or design-wise. They might not have been given the time they were given, because as far as I understood, they went way beyond the original estimates. And again, game development, that always happens. But it seems that, they were allowed to continue development until the game was done. And that's a rare thing. Usually we are constrained by time and money, and we have to finish it, even though it isn't finished. Things are cut, corners are cut, compromises are made. But I think at least from the outside, it looks like they were able to do everything they wanted to, driven from a creative point of view. So of course they made cuts, but it felt the cuts were made as creative choices rather than because of time constraints or budget constraints. I mean, they were a small team, and in the grand scope of things, this was not an expensive game for Sony, which probably makes it a lot easier for them to support the team. But I think that's to their credits, and it's also to the credit of that game company that they were able to push for it. Because as developers, sometimes you don't want to piss people off. You want to deliver. You want to sort of keep your promises. And having to tell somebody, look, we need more time, is hard. But I feel Journey couldn't have existed without being a first-party game, not in the form it eventually took. Not at that time. I mean, 2012 was not a time when Indies yet had their the power that they've had in more recent years. I think still the idea of an independent console game was kind of fresh and new. And it was like when Journey came out, and again, it's hard to time travel, but I think it felt different, not because of the quality of the game, but because of what it was. Here was like a small, weird, different game that did something completely new, and it came from Sony, and it was on the PlayStation 3. That was part of it too. It felt very special and different.
You mentioned that sort of two-thirds aspect of it, in terms of, you know, what defines the game, and we talked about sort of Matt Navis, sort of art design as art direction on the game, but obviously the other big aspect of it, as you alluded to, is Austin Wintory's soundtrack. Fucking hell, if I have not heard something so special in terms of a soundtrack, in terms of, you know, just incredible. There have been, obviously, if at least speaking for me anyway, like in terms of my own favourite games, there have been scores that have come out since that have made me, you know, immensely feel things. Like, to give you a few examples, Last Guardian, Nier Automata, Gris, from Nomada, like a lot of these are just some special soundtracks that have come out since Journey's release. But like, I don't think I'll have ever have heard something so riveting, beautiful, compelling, that is also as well tied heavily into that gameplay experience that
Yeah,
you
and I think
explore in
that's
Journey as well.
yeah, that latter is the most important here. There are a lot of good composers working with games, and there are a lot of games with good scores or great scores even, but sometimes you feel like they are separated, right? I mean, a composer usually comes on towards the end, and they are not part of the team. They are hired to do a job, and they do it in a few months. Sometimes, if it's a bigger game, longer, but oftentimes very quickly. And they do the best they can because, I mean, that's the job in a way. But I think with Journey, it's very clear that that Austin Wintory was sort of part of the team, that he worked closely with the designers, with the art direction, and that choices were made to support the score rather than just have it as background, which is often what happens. And I'm biased here because, I mean, we have a composer on the team, Simon Poole, our composer, who is fantastic and has done some of my favorite game scores, including Draugen, which he's won multiple awards for. Definitely worth listening to if you haven't. And I know sort of the importance of that. In our case, you know, Simon is part of the team. He's there every step of the way. He's part of the design decisions. And that makes the music an integral part of the game and game design. And I think that's so evident in Journey. And I don't think it's not normal. It's not what most games get to do. And again, I think like it's such a big part of that game, and how the music is sort of fits like a glove and is part of every gameplay system, every part of the game. And it's a stirring score. I mean, it's the kind of score that you can listen to independently of the game and still really enjoy, right? I mean, I actually tried to go on Spotify just a couple of hours ago to listen to it. Unfortunately, it's not there. But I went on YouTube and I just put it on, and I worked with that as a background, and it works independently of the game. But then when you sit down and play the game and you see where the music kicks in and what it does, that's a whole other level. And I think it definitely, there's an argument to be said that it's the best use of a game score in any game ever. At least it's up there.
I'm just checking Spotify because I could have sworn that the soundtrack was there at some point. It's not.
It was at some point, but it was been removed. And, you know, to be fair, that's probably not Spotify's fault. That's probably the rights holders pulling it. But that's a shame because you just end up going on YouTube instead, and then nobody gets paid.
That's a goddamn shame. At least in terms of ease of convenience, that's a shame. But like, to touch upon your point, in terms of embedding, you know, composers or like as part of the team and all that there. I've spoken to Robin Hunneke a few times about Journey actually. She actually has her own episode here of my favorite game, but also I interviewed her for a big piece on Journey just to celebrate that game's sort of anniversary at the time, or at least long past that anyway. And I think she said something along. She mentioned a remark at that time that sort of alluded bringing Austin in as embedded as part of the dev team from near enough the outset.
Exactly.
And I think that sort of goes back to sort of what you said there now about, you know, having the music from the outset, like as part of the sort of gameplay experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can tell the difference. I mean, to be fair, this is not something that most indies are able to do for cost reasons, for practical reasons. And in AAA games, there's so many stakeholders that the idea of bringing a composer in as part of the team from the get-go, that's probably not doable. And that's an advantage smaller games have, I think. We did the same with both Dreamfall chapters and especially Draugen, where the music was part of the game from day one, and we shaped the game to work with the music. And that's something we're doing with Dustborn as well. So I can totally see why they did that. They just, everything sort of came together so well there. It's a rare thing, and that's to their credit.
So to properly delve into that sort of gameplay aspect of Journey, or at least in terms of, the places you go to explore, like, at least from what I remember from that sort of, marketing aspect of the game, because I remember when I first seen it in 2010 at Gamescom, it was, like, it led very early on with that sort of desert, like, sort of environment, like, for those first, for the lack of a better term, because you don't really want, I don't know if you really want to call them chapters or levels, but that's what it is, just basically for those first, few chapters, like, it is just that desert aspect. And, I would have been fine if that was the case, because obviously, again, the starter is such, it pops out immediately, and again, I wouldn't have minded if that was just the entire game. But then you go to explore, these sort of massive sand dunes, and then, exploring these ruins, and all of a I just had a massive sort of a chill down my spine just thinking about the sort of, for the lack of a better term, just sliding down the sand, sort of sandboarding and all that there, and just thinking about that, and just thinking, it's such a special moment. Can we just talk about that moment very quickly, because like it's just such
I
a
just
special
re-experienced
moment.
it. Like I said, I sat down just before this call to sort of refresh my memory, and yeah, I mean, that gave me so much immediate joy, and it's almost like Nintendo-like in that way, right? Like where the act of moving in the world is joyful, and so many games fail at that, and I speak for my own games as well, where there's not enough consideration to that. Like movement is just something you do between the other bits, but in Journey, like in most Nintendo games, moving is the journey, so to speak. Moving is gameplay itself. It's that joy of sliding, of slipping, and it's baked into the gameplay experience, where you struggle to walk up a sand dune, but then you get to the top and you slide down the other side. And especially when you have somebody next to you, that becomes a joyful, celebratory feeling.
Like, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, like, just to touch back on the sort of environments aspect, like, it's like, looking back now, like, I remember being somewhat very surprised at how varied it was when I was playing it for the first time, or even just the first few times, because obviously, like I said, there's this assumption that you're just going through the entire desert, or the desert for the entire game, and like I said, I would have been very fine with that, but at the same time, like, then you have, like, those sand dunes, then you're exploring these sort of ruins, and then obviously the mountain itself, and like, I want to touch upon the mountain in specific detail in a moment, but like, it's varied in a way that you're sort of exploring environments that are, like, just feel not pivotal, but like feel pivotal to that sort of moment to moment gameplay of Journey.
Yeah, the environments are amazing, and what's really amazing, when I play games, I'm a game developer, I'm a designer, but I don't.
You're a game developer?
when I play, and it's so easy, I think, to think that to fall into the trap of analyzing everything you're playing, and secondly, I think from the outside, people think that, when game developers play games, they probably just look at it clinically or sort of analytically, and that's not the case for me. Like, most of the time when I play games, I'm just immersed and I'm enjoying myself, but I sort of thought about Journey from that perspective, and I think it's easy to miss how well designed the locations in the world is in Journey. and how that the game constantly pushes you forward, even though you feel you're in this open landscape, this desert, and you could go anywhere, it feels like, even if that's not the case. The game immediately tells you where to go, and it doesn't do it with a minimap or mission markers, which are terrible. I mean, those are crutches that so many games do because they have to, because people get confused and they have no idea where to go. Journey doesn't need those. Journey shows some landmarks. It shows the mountain. The mountain is like the best mission indicator in the world. Who needs a minimap when you know you're going to that mountain? And how do you know it? It's there, right? It is the
literal waypoint.
Exactly. And you pull towards it and you feel the gravity. And I just sat down and played it, and I, with that in mind, and I thought, let me think about this from a playing the game for the first time perspective. And there's no choice. Like the moment you start playing the game, there's that first sand dune with some of these pillars on top of it. And the moment you get there, you see the mountain. And of course the game does tell you that the mountain is important. It shows sort of a brief cinematic and there's a score that swells, but it doesn't even need that. You already have this defining structure, and it's gravity, right? You're pulled towards that. And like you said, the map evolves and you dip in and out of ruins and you go underground, but then you re-emerge and you're never lost. You're never confused. I think the only time I ever was, I don't think the word is lost, but when I felt I wasn't completely sure where I was when you're sort of ascending this structure. I think about 2/3 of the way through the game, and you sort of trying to rise up again from.
I know the section you're on about. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's when you sort of you've been underground for a while, and you're just sort of you're longing for light again. You're longing for the sight of the mountain, and then when you emerge, it feels like a real accomplishment. But the game never needs to tell you, "Hey, go to the mountain," or "Hey, sort of reach the end of this level." It doesn't need to. It is so clear at all times, and that is incredibly difficult. There's a reason why most games have a minimap. They just weren't able to tell people where to go through environments and through the art. But Journey does that. You never need a UI. You just know exactly where to go.
And like just to touch upon that sort of waypoint aspect of it, Journey's a very clean looking game as well. Like, not in terms of the art design and all that there, but I mean more in the UI. There's nothing there. Like, there's literally nothing there. Like, there's nothing to sort of... Literally, the only prompt you're given in terms of a UI, a user experience, is just press X or press start to play at the start of the game, and that's it. Like, it's very clean.
And they show you the controller at certain points. They don't tell you, like...
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
They don't tell you what it does. They show a little image of a controller, and then that only happens 2 or 3 times, I think at the beginning of the game. I mean, and I think this also speaks to Sony's involvement. They're breaking the rules. You are supposed to have a sort of... There's a way to start up games, and they sort of disregard that, and that's fantastic. I love that. And I found myself, I wanted to invert the y-axis because, I play properly and I have to invert the y-axis. And I actually couldn't figure out how to do that. It took me a little while. I had to press the touchpad in order to make that happen. So it goes to even that extreme. It tells you nothing. But I love that. I think games should always strive to remove user interface. And I think game developers and game designers are often cautious about that because we don't want any roadblocks preventing the player from enjoying the game. And I think sometimes you're stuck with having to give constant instructions because the game is so complex. But Journey is all about paring things back, right? It's about removing things in the art, in the narrative, and in the user interface and the controls. It's so obvious that sort of they've just carefully pruned this until only the essence is left, and they trust the players. They trust that players are able to understand how to play the game from those simple instructions. And they were proven right. People are able to get into it, to enjoy it without being force-fed tutorials about how to move or how to jump or how to chirp or do anything. It's allowing players to experiment and figure it out on their own, and then they own it. It is so much more impactful, I think, when players are allowed to do that.
One of my favorite aspects about Journey that I've actually written about before is the multiplayer. Well, I say multiplayer in the sort of loosest sense, because it's not multiplayer in a traditional sense. Like, it is just you and someone else. But the beautiful part is you don't know who that person is. You won't know who that person is until the end of the game when you see their name in the credits. And for me at the time, who was very, and still is, very online multiplayer adverse, like, I won't play, or at the very least, I will very rarely play multiplayer games in public servers or, whatnot. I will only play, for the most part, otherwise with friends. The only exception to that being probably Splatoon, because one, you don't have to deal with, sort of toxic voice chat. Two, you don't have to worry about toxic, text chat. And three, it is Splatoon. It's just stupidly fun, a lot more fun with multiplayer than single player stuff, although I've not to play the single player stuff for Splatoon 2 yet. But I digress. The point I'm trying to sort of make is that with Journey's multiplayer, it felt very, it did feel like a breath of fresh air, because obviously you weren't dealing with the sort of toxic aspects of what you would expect within multiplayer within a game anyway. Like, it just felt like, for the sake of, again, for the lack of a better description, like, it just felt very wholesome, very helpful, and very powerful in a way.
Yeah, and this is extremely important, I think. The funny thing is that playing it just now, there was nobody else around. And Journey works without other people. But I think people who sort of play it for the first time now, they are losing out on something that really defined the game. So I often talk about Journey when I talk to people who don't know about games, when I talk about narratives in games, and I talk about what games are. Because first off, it is a very personal thing to me, how sort of Journey affects me as a player. And secondly, it's sort of, I think it speaks to the diversity of games, that we can have a game like this and a story told in this way. But I remember very clearly, I think this probably was the first time I played played Journey, and I played Journey a bunch of different times. But I remember joining forces with somebody quite early on, and chirping at each other and moving together and sort of guiding each other onwards. And then there was a moment where we were sliding down or surfing down this tunnel with these sort of windows looking out at the landscape, and the sun was setting. Yeah. And I started to cry, because it's like there was a moment there where the feeling of companionship and togetherness, of sharing something that was so strikingly beautiful, it made me tear up. And like, I felt so powerfully connected to somebody who could be anybody, anywhere in the world. And the fact that we couldn't talk, and the fact that I didn't know who this was, I think that made these feelings stronger. It made me feel like it's possible to connect with somebody who's sitting on a PlayStation 3 somewhere in the world. This could be a 10-year-old, this could be an 80-year-old, this could be a Japanese person, they could be American, they could be somewhere in Africa, and I have no idea. But we are connected, we are sharing this incredible moment together. And I can't remember being that sort of emotionally affected in any sort of media experience or story experience ever. And moving through the game with this person just made the experience so much stronger than it would have been going on my own. And I distinctly remember in the same section of the game where you're sort of ascending again to the ground and you're sort of trying to find a way up, of losing that person, and the feeling of immediate panic and almost desperation of not being able to continue my journey with them. That also made me sort of, it affected me so strongly. And those two moments have stuck with me, the sort of feeling of connection and togetherness, and that feeling of loss when my companion disappeared. And then, like you said, you get to the end of the game and you see a scrolling list of the people you met in the game, but you don't actually know which of those was the person you spent those precious moments with. Or even if there was a single person, it could have been like a combination of people. But in my head, it was a person. And in my head, it feels almost, it's okay to not know who that was or where they're from, or, you know, or to contact that person and say, hey, want to be PlayStation friends? That would be detrimental to the sort of the feeling you're left with of this sort of connection across the world and through sort of this artistic experience. It's immensely powerful. And I've talked to people who came to Journey late, and they sort of, you know, I've talked it up and said, you know, you should play this game. So it's my favorite game. And they played it and I go like, yeah, it's okay. And I asked, well, did you meet somebody else? They're like, no, it's just me. And like, it's clear that if you weren't there, if you didn't have the chance to experience the game that way, maybe Journey can't be as significant as it was to me and millions of other people.
And just another aspect of the multiplayer that feels like it worked very well was that sort of name and communication aspect of the game. Because again, in terms of the communication aspect, you don't have a mic. You can't use a mic in Journey. Like the only way you can communicate is that chirp, that sort of chirp. And even then, like if you tap it, like you give it this sort of bloop, and then if you just sort of press it, goes like sort of higher voiced chirp. But then if you hold it down, it's a sort of like a scream of sorts, like a sort of or something like that. I'm just sort of making my own noises at this point. For any sound directors or sound designers who want to use those voices, feel free to email me for my services. But in all seriousness, like what I felt was very fascinating in terms of that sort of communication system was the fact that it was very open to interpretation. Like in terms of context, like it could mean anything. Like it could mean follow me, let's go this way, such and such and such. Like it felt very, again, it was very unique.
Yeah, and number one, I think it speaks to human nature in a way that very few experiences do. It's that interpretation, right? That person's very simple body language. You don't have a lot of things you can do. You can run in circles, you can run in direction, you can bump, you can't even bump into people because there's no collision between players. But that combination of just having that single button that makes a series of different chirps in tune with the music, and basically your emotions, and then to basically create a language on the fly together with this other person, that's amazing. And it sort of transcends geography and cultural background and language, and you make yourself understood in a way that is so human and yet is unique to this medium, because in the real world we have lots of other avenues for communication, but I think Journey would have failed if it had traditional communication. I mean, I dislike multiplayer gaming for the most part, even though I worked on MMOs, so I should probably not say that, but I avoid multiplayer games for the most part because I don't want to be yelled at by 14-year-old American teenagers. I don't want the pressure a lot of the time. I play games to have fun. I don't want to feel like competition or to be, to have demands on me. And I'm an introvert. I don't necessarily always want to play together with people. I like having these solo experiences, but I do like the fact that I can have a solo experience in a world where there are others and where I can, in some way touch other people's lives and they can touch me. And I think the simplicity of the communication in Journey is the key to its success. At least on that part, on that front. I think if you had text communication or voice communication or an advanced sort of glyph system that could be used to string together sentences, it wouldn't be Journey. It wouldn't be this deeply emotional, deeply personal experience that you can interpret in any way you want. I mean, the narrative in Journey is up to interpretation, but the communication between players is also up to interpretation. And I think that means that players are kinder to each other. It's a game that invites kindness. It invites acts of generosity, because even people who are sort of drawn to grieving or drawn to destruction, they don't have the tools to do that. And you know what happens? People are nice. Maybe this is something Facebook and Twitter could learn from as well, but take away the tools to be an asshole, and people gravitate towards helpfulness and kindness, I think.
That's a very interesting way to sort of look at that. That's something for me to ponder on. Probably, and like you say, probably for the social platforms they sort of ponder on as well. The other thing that I want to sort of tie that to sort of one of the main big aspects of Journey, that sort of communication and playing with that second player. Probably one of my favorite moments ever in a game that I'll ever experience is going through the mountain at the very end of the game. Like, going through that and sort of having that experience, that very, like, last ditch sort of reach towards the peak of the mountain and going from there. Like, it's very dire and stuff like that there, but then it obviously picks itself back up again. It gives you hope, and then you're flying through all these sort of mountaintops and stuff like that there, and all these other I want to say players, for the lack of a better term, or just sort of other I don't want to say creatures, because they're not really creatures. I don't know what to really call them.
Spirits, souls.
Okay, yeah, spirits, souls. That's the greatest way to describe that, because that sort of brings me to my point. When I reached the mountaintop, like as it is playing it for the first time, it really destroyed me in a good way, in terms of emotionally. Like, it really destroyed me. It's like I remember, like, like shedding one or two tears, like going through that light. But then I remember playing a lot towards the end of 2013, when I was sort of going through my games of the generation at that time, because we were just coming into the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. And I was, because of the short length of Journey, you're only playing it for like 9 minutes, 2 hours tops. I figured I would only play it for 2 or 3 times, just to sort of sort of ground my feelings for it, and like sort of set a foundation. But the first time I played it, just so I could sort of understand where it was in terms of, my game of the generation list at that time, I only needed to play it once. And the reason for that is because I finally found someone to come through with me to the mountains, to the end of the games, as you're floating up through the mountains with those spirits, watching you fly up and all that there. And then the both of us, like, just walking into the light at the end. Ragnar, I actually lost it. I actually full on cried. That was the first time I'd ever gone through the end of the game, through the light, with someone else. And I remember, like, just sort of feeling like very emotional, crying, not necessarily a lot, but just crying. That was very powerful. That felt very special to me. It felt very, like, not necessarily connected, but like it felt very, again, it just felt very special and very unique to me in a way. Like, that moment in the entire game just sort of sums up the whole experience of Journey. That journey of discovery, but the fact that you're doing it with someone else at the very end just sort of sums it up.
Yeah. And first off, yeah, absolutely. I when I had that experience the first time, and probably also the second time, I there were tears as well, because it is powerful. And I think that, Journey is what you put into it, I feel. I think the people who don't get journey or don't enjoy it, or don't find meaning and emotion there, they're not putting that meaning and emotion into the game. And I think I definitely did, and I do when I play the game. And it's the kind of game that rewards your own personal investment and emotional investment in it. I think it's more powerful when you share that experience with a stranger and you sort of, like you said, take that final step into the light with them, and you have that joyful leap from, when you're climbing up the mountain and you, through the snowstorm, and at least in my head, you die, and then you're reborn as a spirit, a soul, and you rise and you rise and you rise, and you have that sort of joyful symphony of all these souls joining together towards the peak of the mountain, and then that sort of that final step into being, I don't know, reborn or going back to the beginning. It devastated me too, and it's probably what cemented the game as my favorite game of all time. But I also feel like it's exactly the kind of experience where you have to bring something to the table. I think the game is giving you a lot, but if you're not giving back in a way, if you're not investing in what you're seeing and experiencing and letting that be transcend just the mechanic of responding to what's happening on the screen, I don't think you're going to get the experience that the two of us had. And I think it's a game that then demands that from players. It demands sort of empathy, and it demands sort of letting the game trigger feelings in you. I don't think that developers necessarily are forcing you to feel anything, but it's allowing you to feel stuff, and that's important. They're not telling you to feel any specific things, but the game triggers those feelings in a lot of us.
Just to go back on that last thing, and you mentioned the sort of interpretation of it, because like that was something that I remember having a conversation on with a fellow critic of the game, or well, someone who was also sort of writing about the game at that time, and like for me, like that, I think if I remember correctly, that person was sort of seeing it as the interpretation of death, in that you're going through the light and you're basically, for the lack of a better description, you're basically going into heaven. Whereas for me, I more or less see it as the interpretation of birth, like you're being reborn. Like, and I think you said there now, like you saw it sort of as a sort of moment of rebirth, if I remember correctly, right?
Correct. And I think this speaks to the game being very spiritual. You could maybe call it religious, but that's such
I would probably lean that way, yeah.
But I think it can be read that way by people. But I think it's definitely spiritual, and I think it's a game that is about the journey of life, and at least that's what it meant to me. And it is a game that is about death and rebirth, again, in my head. And I think that's also why it's powerful, at least for me. I do spend, like a lot of us, time thinking of death and sort of the end of the journey. And the hopefulness of Journey, the game, makes it's more impactful. We have the moment of desperation, of fighting against this impossible wind, of being sort of pushed back from the final step of the journey upwards, and the cold closing in, and as I see it, the body dying, and then the spirit being released and reborn, and then going through a rebirth into a new person at the end, or another chance at the journey. I try not to sort of overanalyze it. To me, I'm not trying to find a deeper meaning there, because I don't care. I care how it makes me feel and what it means to me personally. And to me, like what the developers intended, I think that's kind of unimportant. And I haven't spoken to the developers, but in a way, I think they feel the same way, that they have their own interpretation, but they're in no way trying to force that on the player. But I do think that the game is actually and intentionally spiritual. I think it's hard to play this game and not have thoughts about, like you said, birth, rebirth, death, life in some way, right? Because it's not in your face, but I think there are so many things there that are culturally significant in terms of sort of the spirituality of the game, and that are human, that are so common to us of experiencing sort of this journey towards sort of the end. I think it's hard for people not to have at least some spiritual connection with this game.
I'm just going through my Google Drive because mentioning the sort of spiritual aspect, the religious aspect of Journey. When I wrote for an anniversary of Journey's release a few years ago for Eurogamer, and there was something that stood out immensely for me in my interviews with Genova Chen, Kelly Santiago, and Robin Honeke. But there was an answer that Robin Honeke gave me in, like, we did 2 interviews for that piece that I wrote, and it was at the end of that second piece that stood out to me, and I'm just trying to get the transcript up of it now. But basically, I think it was something along the line we were just basically discussing the sort of spiritual aspect of Journey, and I'm just trying to bring up the transcript here, like and I remember just asking her, like, do you believe in reincarnation? And I'm just sort of reading through the answer she gives. Now, like, I'm literally reading this in real time, like, and I remember her answer being so profound, so in keeping with what Journey is about. It's about that journey and that interpretation of it. In this case, just sort of rebirth and as Robin says, reincarnation. Like, it was a very profound moment for me. It's one of my favorite interviews actually I've ever done, and especially for and because of that answer she gave.
Yeah, and I think this is rare in game development too, right? To have such thematic depth and thoughtfulness in what the game is communicating and telling. It's rare. It's really hard. I mean, we all strive for it. We all strive to have games that have something to say beyond the surface level, where the story and the game mechanics work together to give you that experience. And there's only a handful of games that I think have given me that. I mean, another game that comes to mind is Brothers, and I don't know if you've played that game through to the end, but where you feel you're rewarded in a way for learning how the game works and for playing the game, and you're rewarded thematically. And I think that's the case with Journey as well. I think it is obvious that the developers had something in mind. But what I do appreciate is that they're not forcing it on us. They're not telling us that here is the single interpretation. I think they have their interpretation, but I think it is also very clear to me that they're leaving the door open for multiple interpretations. And you know what? That makes it more personal for people, because that means we can put ourselves in it.
Absolutely. So in that case then, like, let's start to bring this in a little bit. What else do you like about Journey that we've not discussed yet?
I think we covered a lot of it. I mean, I think one thing that is important to me about the game is that it is a game about being alone. It's even a game about loneliness sometimes. But it's a game that sort of allows for that. It doesn't make being alone in this world a detriment to the experience. It makes that it's still a beautiful experience. And then when you meet other people, you can then choose to sort of walk alongside them, and you can choose to leave them. You can choose to stay and do something else. And the game doesn't punish you for that. It's not like you need 2 people to cross a barrier, or that you need to rely on other people. And I think it's made by people who are comfortable with loneliness and comfortable with the idea of being alone in a game or in real life. And I think that's great. I think sometimes games and society in general, they sort of point to the person alone as being sort of the outsider or the person who are sort of in some way disadvantaged. But Journey doesn't say that at all. You can play the game on your own, and there are advantages to playing together, but the advantages are more emotional than they are mechanical. And I really appreciate that. It's a game for introverts in a lot of ways. And it's also a game that is melancholy. And melancholy to me is my favorite emotion in many ways. And it's a game about sort of the loss of a world, right? You're walking through the ruins of something, and the story of this world is there. But again, it's a story that can be interpreted. It's not told to you. You basically have to tell yourself this story. And I remember playing this game with my daughter, and I can't remember how old she was at the time, but maybe she was 6 or 7 at this point. And I remember her sort of coming up with her own story based on these images and what was happening. And as a storyteller in games, that's incredible to see how, the games I work on, there's so much dialogue, there's so much storytelling, there's so much of it that's told to you. And while it's difficult to tell a story that way too, it is even more difficult to tell a story without any words or without any clear sort of signs, where all of it is sort of embedded in the world, and it's a story you, the player, have to tell yourself. But that's super powerful because it makes the story yours, and I think that's often underappreciated.
It's funny that you mentioned those sort of emotional mechanics, gameplay mechanics. Like doesn't feel like there's many games that do those sorts of things, like those sorts of emotional mechanics that you mentioned besides Journey. Actually, maybe, although it's been a while since I've played it, maybe What Remains of Edith Finch as well, to an extent.
Yeah, definitely. It's a much denser game. I mean, in Edith Finch uses sort of a plethora of mechanics and sort of a constant stream of content to do some of the same things, but it's such a radically different way. But absolutely, that's also a game that tells a story in a fantastic way. But I think
and very
the game,
melancholy, like you say as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think a game that is sort of close in some ways to Journey for me is Brothers. And I don't know if you played the game, and if you haven't, I'm not going to spoil the ending, and I also don't want to spoil the ending for the people listening to this podcast. But that's a game that has, it's pretty clear that I think the people who made Brothers did play Journey, and not in a way that they sort of stole anything, but the sort of the feeling of this journey you're on. And in that game, you're playing two brothers and you're sort of on the journey together. But there's some of the same emotions there. It's more of a fairy tale world, but it's still a world that is sort of unexplained to you. But the greatest thing about Brothers is how these sort of emotional aspects and emotional mechanics come together at the end. And when games do that, and I think there aren't a ton of examples, but when they accomplish that, when the mechanics and the emotions go hand in hand, that is incredibly powerful. And it's rare, and it's so precious when it happens. And I'd love to see more of that, and I'd love to be able to pull something like that off myself, but it's hard. I think sometimes it happens through the happy accident of being a team that's sort of tight-knit in terms of narrative, game design, audio, music, art direction. And sometimes it's just brilliant people doing brilliant things, which I think is the case with Journey. But it's also time. Art takes time. I don't think Journey could have been made in a year by a fresh team. It needed the games that they had made before, and it needed the time it had to become what it is.
This hurts to say because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like, what didn't you like about Journey? Is there anything you don't like about Journey, at least?
No, I think it's many ways a perfect game. And there's a reason.
Well, in that case, then, like, let me ask, what would define a perfect game for you in that way?
A feeling, the feeling you're left with having played it. Whether you play through the whole thing or you play a part of it. I don't like nitpicking stuff. I try not to. I try
fair.
to let myself be pulled into things. I appreciate when things make me feel a certain way and make me feel good, and when they do, I am very forgiving about a lot of stuff. If a piece of art or a game or a movie or a book can make me feel something, not necessarily something new, just feel something important, and I think about it afterwards, then I'm very forgiving, and I try not to nitpick or find flaws in it. And while I'm sure Journey has flaws, like I said, when I sat down and played it earlier today, I couldn't figure out how to invert the y-axis immediately. Is that a flaw? No. I mean, is it important? No. And again, like, it's so easy for us, for, you know, game developers, for players, for game critics to nitpick, because we all do that, and it sometimes is part of our job to nitpick as well. I mean, the games I work on myself, I have to nitpick, but it's so nice to be able to just sit down and play something where that makes you feel something, and then just immerses you, and it takes you on a journey through a narrative, through a world, through game mechanics, and then just, you can just let it be. You don't have to find anything wrong with it. And yeah, to me then, Journey is a perfect game. I played it many times, which I never do, and at no point have I felt frustrated with it, or no point has the experience been lessened. It's still sort of a complete experience, and it still is as good a game as it ever was.
This actually probably hurts a lot more than my last question, but is there anything you would change from a design perspective? Is there anything from that you would sort of look at and change and go, yeah?
When you look at a piece of art, do you feel like, oh, I wish I could change this bit of it? I don't know. I don't think most people do. I don't think I could have made Journey. It's a game that, it doesn't make me feel envious or jealous of like their talents. It's just a game that goes like, yeah, this is the creation of somebody from a different background, different perspective than I have. This is something I could have never made. I would never have tried to change that. And that's not the case with everything. There are games when I go like, oh, I wish they didn't do that, or TV shows or movies where I feel like, oh man, if they'd only done this. But Journey is like on a list of games where I feel like, no, I couldn't have done this. There's no way I could have improved this. There's no way I could have told them how to improve this. It is its own thing, and it is a piece of art that is made by a group of people as a complete experience, and it has their personalities in it. It has their sort of craft in it, and I don't think anybody else could have made that game better. It is very personal. It is a piece of art.
Just to sort of round off on Journey, then, I want to touch way back on something that you sort of mentioned in passing, in terms of, you know, Journey. I can't remember the exact way you described it, but like, basically, like, it was here in my notes, but just basically how Journey sort of went on to define the indie scene in terms of what makes an indie game. It really feels like Journey was the game that exploded everything, in the sense that, yeah, okay, it feels hypocritical to say this, because obviously Journey was published and funded by Sony, yes, very hypocritical, but it also has that indie game feel to it, in that it's a very small team of, I think if I remember correctly, it was a team of 10, 12 people that made Journey. And when Journey came out, it came out in a year full of, in a year where indie games seemed to explode. Like, obviously, there was Journey, but there was also the first season of Telltale's The Walking Dead, and those two games sort of helped headline not only what 2012 was for the games industry, but also like sort of made players look beyond, the games coming from, the mega publishers, like the platform holders, like Sony or Microsoft or the third parties like EA, Activision, Ubisoft, Take-Two, whatever, it defined the indie scene for me, at least from my interpretation of it. Like, how do you see how Journey has sort of defined not even necessarily just the indie scene, but like even its legacy? What do you think is that game's legacy?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's at the forefront of like a wave of indie games, especially on consoles, right? Because indie games did exist before Journey and before Braid on Xbox 360. Another one of those early indie games that really defined the industry. But they were on PC, or they were on, maybe on Mac once in a while. But consoles were they were closed to most indies. Consoles was where you had the big games, the proper games, the grown-up games. But I think Journey opened that door, and I think a lot of people looked at Journey and saw that, holy crap, we can make something that is as profiled as the quote unquote big games, that has the support of the first parties, that looks beautiful and looks incredible, but also doesn't look like anything else out there. It doesn't look try to be realistic or anything like that. But it's also a game that's approachable. It's not like too artsy or too indie in terms of, having obscure mechanics or being too experimental. It's a game that's actually very quote unquote casual friendly. It's a game that anybody can play. And I think that's also a big reason for its success. I do think in this, indie developers, some took the wrong lessons from that game. I think actually Journey is a commercial title. I think it's a game that marries the approachability of not casual gaming, but approachable games, and marries that with interesting themes. But it's presented in a way that it's, nobody can look at that game and not think it's beautiful. It doesn't try to be idiosyncratic in any way. It is just beautiful. And I think some indie developers and some indie games took the wrong inspiration from it. I think, some people look at Journey and say, "Ooh, puzzle platformer, let's do that." It's not that at all. It's just, again, it's just a journey. It's not a game that's about the mechanics. But I think it opened the door. I think it made Sony realize the strength and importance of small teams doing new things. I think the whole industry took notice. I don't think everything that came out of Journey from other companies is, necessarily positive. But in general, it it opened people's eyes, I think, in both the media and amongst players to the potential for indie gaming and the potential success of indie gaming, how indie games could be huge, how they can find a massive audience as long as they were available on platforms that people had in their homes.
And it's interesting that you mentioned how Sony after Journey's release, it opened up a lot of eyes, and including Sony, in terms of small teams. In a way, it also feels like a shame it sort of closed down that small indie incubation unit within Sony Santa Monica to help indies and all that there, because Giant Sparrow was initially part of that crew as well, that was incubated within Sony Santa Monica and put out the Unfinished Swan. And I think when Sony closed down that arm of Sony Santa Monica, it felt like a lot of that magic of what made that sort of incubation crew and the indie games that Sony Santa Monica, outside of the AAA team within that studio, the God of War team, whatever, they put out a lot of great smaller titles, and when they closed that down, it felt like a small sort of part of that Sony died. But on the lob side of it as well, if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't have had Annapurna Interactive. So in a way, it balances out, maybe. I don't I don't want to say, um, I don't know what I'm saying at this point, but basically, I think what I'm trying to get at is the cliche of when one door closes, another one opens, basically.
Yeah, I think Journey opened a lot of doors. And I think, again, I mean, Sony has done a lot for indie games.
Oh, for sure.
But not prior to Journey. I mean, to be honest, Microsoft with the Xbox 360 was the first to open the door for indies on consoles. I mean, Sony did invite indies to the PSP, the PlayStation Portable. But the PlayStation 3 was wholly the big consoles were sort of reserved. They didn't want to sort of clutter that with small and weird games, and I think like it's very true. Like Sony opened that door, and they were unable to sort of to grow that. But I also think some opportunities were lost, and I think both Microsoft and Sony have at times succeeded in encouraging indie development, and at other times completely discouraged it. And I think that sort of tide goes up and down. I do hope we've landed now on a point where people do understand both the creative value and the commercial value of having a lot of indie games on their platform, or having sort of a wealth of games from different developers of different genres. Even Nintendo has embraced that and learned that. And yeah, I think Journey will be remembered as one of, I mean, it would be completely wrong to call it sort of the first big indie games. I mean, that's disregarding decades of work on platforms like PC and Mac, where companies have risen and done amazing things. But consoles were different. They were closed, and I think Journey opened doors.
Honorable mentions, go for it.
Yeah, so I mean, when you asked me to be part of this podcast, I actually struggled a bit trying to think of which game to bring to the table. Journey was the first game I thought about, but I was also sure that somebody else would have talked about it by now, and then I scrolled to the list of previous podcasts, and he wasn't there, which was great. But it's I don't always have a single game, so there's a long list of games, and that list is probably way too long for a single podcast. I think we could have probably a seasonal podcast talking about my long list of favorite games.
Like I said earlier, sort of mini series, and even then that would have been just on Journey.
Yeah, exactly. It would go for seasons, but as part of the process of sort of thinking about like should I talk about Journey or something else, I did come up with a list, and Uncharted 2 is high up on that list. Uncharted 2 is probably my favorite of games that do more traditional storytelling. I think Uncharted 2 tells a rousing story incredibly well. It is a better Indiana Jones than at least the last Indiana Jones film. It's a game that's incredibly well written, incredibly well directed in terms of the voice acting. That looks fantastic. It still looks fantastic. I replayed it quite recently. And it's a game that sort of just, does the traditional storytelling better than pretty much any game has ever done. I do think the game has flaws. I think there's just way too much shooting and way too much carnage to really sort of thematically work. But when Uncharted 2 is good, it is better than most other games. We talked about Day the Tentacle briefly earlier. I think that's, to me, the quintessential LucasArts adventure game, where the game design, the puzzle design is so brilliant with the 3 time periods and how that sort of integrates. And that's a marvel of mechanical design. And it's also very, very funny. I think it is funnier than the Monkey Island games. I think the characters are fantastic. It has a pretty, for its time, a cast that was, different. And that felt unique, and it felt slightly more diverse than other games. And it's also a game that looks, or at least looked, beautiful. I haven't revisited Day of the Tentacle. I kind of want to, but I'm also kind of afraid of doing it because it is a game that it meant a lot to me when I first played it. It was also one of my first CD-ROM games. So, having the full voice acting and sort of how quickly it could go from scene to scene. It was kind of revolutionary in that sense. Portal 2 is on my list. I think in terms of mechanical puzzle design, I mean, I'm not a huge puzzle fan. I usually find myself, I'm not smart enough to solve puzzles, and it can get frustrating. But Portal 2, it's just, when you get stuck, you want to keep trying, and then when you solve it, which you always do, you feel so good about it. And of course, Portal 2 is a marvel of storytelling, of characterization. It's such a beautiful game, and I don't know why they haven't made Portal 3. I guess that goes for a lot of potential sequels from Valve.
Do you want to know a secret? Do you want to know a secret? It's because they can't count to 3.
Well, there you go. I think it's almost true, because they've had such success counting 1, 2 that it's like almost like a steep drop off where like they're daunted by the number. And I think topping Portal 2 is hard. It is a fantastic game, and one I would like to revisit soon. Halo is on my list. I do like first person shooters. Halo, I think, was something brand new when it came. The feeling of this open world, a really dense story. It felt like that game had a world and a history. I've lost track along the way. I mean, I played most of the Halo games. I haven't played the last one. But the first Halo, married to sort of the original Xbox, and how that was sort of technologically ahead of other consoles at the time, made that into a pretty incredible experience. Witcher 3 is up there. I don't know quite why The Witcher 3 has so many flaws, but it is also a game that has humanity. It has some amazing characters and stories in it that are unexpected and really well told. I'm not a huge fan of The Witcher himself, but some of the characters around him are characters that stayed with me. And it's also a world that feels sort of raw and beautiful and interesting compared to sort of many of the more polished fantasy worlds. It feels real. And that's something I really appreciate. Eternal Darkness.
I was just going to say as well, for anyone listening, it's worth noting that we are actually recording this the day Cyberpunk 2077 comes out as well. So that just feels very interesting to note. Sorry, you mentioned Eternal Darkness.
Yeah, no, and actually to I mean, I'm excited for Cyberpunk, but I'm also going to give it time, and I'm kind of worried about it. So I'm sort of digesting what people are saying about it now, but I definitely am going to visit that game. Yeah, so Eternal Darkness is a game that a lot of people don't know about. It's a GameCube game published by Nintendo, which is odd because it is a sort of a Cthulhu mythos game that really screws with the player's perception. It's a game that sort of seems to take control of your console and your TV and do weird things as sort of sanity effects. And that game has stuck with me a lot, especially at a time where sort of the user interfaces of TVs all looked the same. So that game sort of emulated the look of a volume button and turned on the volume on your TV. And I thought sort of that was actually happening, but it was the game sort of just messing with you. So that's a really interesting and I think a really cool game. I mentioned Brothers already. A fantastic game. I don't think I need to say more about that, but it's definitely one of my favorites. Fable 2, that's probably a controversial one.
Not controversial in my eyes. That's the fucking best Fable game. That's the best Fable game.
It is. And I'm a fan of the Fable games. I mean, I Peter Molyneux promises a lot, but I felt that with Fable 2, he delivered on a lot of the promises. The dog in that game, I think, works beautifully. It's the first time I've had a pet in a game that I felt actually close to, and how that dog sort of seeks you out when it's been hurt and sort of crawls after you for miles to get you. Amazing. And I love the humor in that game. I think like to sort of have the Blackadder-ish, Monty Python-ish humor mixed into this sort of traditional fantasy setting, or very sort of British fantasy setting, I think it works really well. It's underappreciated, I think.
I agree.
Doom, the original Doom, was a game that made me feel something completely new at that time. The feeling of dread and menace and danger, and sort of the art style and the sounds that are sort of still, part of my psyche. I think I can still hear the doors opening in Doom. Fantastic game. Colin Mcrae Rally. I'm a sucker for driving games and racing games, and I think that's also up there. I don't think I've ever would have chosen it as my favorite game, but I have such great memories of racing against my ghost in that game, and yeah, I could talk for a long time about that. And then finally, I am a fan of the Grand Theft Auto games, mostly because of the worlds. I am never really a huge fan of the stories, but I love the scope of the worlds. And I think trying to sort of think of the one that has stuck the most with me, I think it's actually San Andreas. Again, one of the underappreciated ones. People mention, Vice City or GTA, the original GTA 3, but San Andreas was sort of so ambitious at the time, all of California. It was so broken in some ways, and it's such a janky game if you look at it now. But at the time, when I've played that game, the sense of freedom and scope and the world and a place where I could just go out and do whatever I wanted, that was amazing. So yeah, those are honorable mentions, and that list could probably have been twice as long if I'd had more prep time.
You mentioned Grand Theft Auto. Dear sweet child, may I interest you in Grand Theft Auto 4?
I do like that game a lot. I am not a fan of the main character in that game. As much as I was in San Andreas, I think.
Okay.
And also I think San Andreas had like a scope to it. Like it tried to do multiple cities for the first time in a GTA game. And there's something to be said for that, I think, just the immense scope of it. I mean, of course, I'm a fan of GTA 5 as well. But GTA 4, I think, was the one where I felt like, this character is not somebody I enjoy being with. It felt like this person was just unpleasant in some ways.
I think for me, the reason why I banged the drum for GTA 4 more than probably any other game, with GTA 3 just behind it because of how much GTA 3 changed everything, is because I feel like, and I said this before, GTA 4 feels like such a maturation and maturity of Rockstar, especially following Hot Coffee and what happened with that in San Andreas. And I think a lot of that is down to Nico's story, and I think it's because Nico feels such more of a, not necessarily darker character, but feels a lot more. He's seen stuff. He's gone through stuff a lot more than say likes of CJ or Tommy Vercetti or any of the characters in GTA 5, like Franklin or Trevor or Michael or stuff, something like that. There, I think that's sort of why GTA 4 sticks out for me. But it's really interesting to see or to hear even. You say, yeah, you couldn't really connect with Nico.
Yeah, and I think like you're absolutely right. And Nico was an attempt to do a character that had a lot more depth to him, and much more of an arc to him. You know what really bothered me though? It's because here is a guy who is supposed to struggle with his past and the things he has done, and being a murderer, and actually having a sort of a change of heart, or who's actually bothered by it. But then you're playing in a game where violence is the point, and I just couldn't get over that disconnect. And in some ways, even though I don't like Trevor in GTA 5, I think he's an awful person. He is the perfect GTA protagonist. He is a man who takes immense joy in destruction and violence and death, right? And while I don't think the GTA games are about causing death and destruction, you do it accidentally, right? Like, it's hard to drive through that world without killing people, or go through a mission without like murdering 50 people. And in a way, Trevor is the character where you feel there's no disconnect between the narrative and what you're doing. But with Nico, I felt the greatest disconnect, because I totally agree with you. He was a character that was interesting in terms of what he was and where he'd been and where he wanted to go. But then you had the whole thing where he just kept killing people, and he kept running over people, and he kept doing terrible things. And it was hard to sort of sympathize and empathize with his stated desires and the game mechanics of what you were doing.
No, fair enough. I understand that. So, top 3 games ever. How would you rank them? Obviously, Journey at the top, but what would you fill 2 and 3 with?
Uncharted 2. And the third one is much harder. I think it's between Day of the Tentacle and Portal 2. It's hard. I think like Portal 2 holds up better. I think if I was to sit down and play today, I would probably rank Portal 2 higher. But I think Day of the Tentacle is a game that's probably belongs in the third slot because of how it sort of inspired me and it led to where I am today. So let's hammer the list down to Journey, Uncharted 2, and Day of the Tentacle.
Let's talk for a few minutes then about Dustborn then. So you announced that you are publishing the game with Quantic Dream. I sort of want to get an idea of how that came about, because obviously we know Quantic Dream from their own games like Heavy Rain, Detroit, Fahrenheit, or Indigo Prophecy if you're American. Like, how did that come about? Like what sort of made you want to sign with them, basically?
So we've been working on Dustborn for quite a while now. The game has been sort of in pre-production since August of last year, but the concept development of Dustborn began much further back in 2016, actually, which was a year of, I think, defining political change for a lot of us, and a year that made me feel like, what the hell am I doing making games? I mean, this is not helping the world. And we felt that if we're going to make more games, they had to be more meaningful. They had to be games that could speak to what was happening in our feelings and emotions about those major changes in both America, the UK, and in Europe in general. But the intent back then was that we were going to develop the game, take it as far as possible, maybe take it all the way to the end and publish it ourselves as we have done before, and be in creative control, because that's incredibly important to us, and especially with Dustborn, which is a game that in some ways can be controversial. It's a game about themes that touch on real world events, even though it's set in an alternate future America, run by a fascist police force and a sort of a dictatorship or a president for life. It's still a game that is going to cause controversy, and we're probably going to hear from people who are not happy with with our point of view, or with a Norwegian developer's portrayal of America. So it was super important to us to, either make the game completely on our own, or to find somebody who understood and bought into what we wanted to do with the game. And, I don't think any of us ever felt that we could go to a big publisher and to have them alongside this without making changes to the game, understandably enough. Not everybody is interested in courting controversy, or to talk about these themes, or to portray America in this way. So we also knew that while we could bring the game to the market ourselves, we would have to make compromises. We don't have a lot of money. We fund our games entirely through sort of the sales of our existing games or our current games, and through various grants and other funding sources. So to make Dustborn into what we really wanted with it, we needed somebody to help us to step in and publish the game. And we've been talking with Quantic Dream for a long time, actually. I think, close to a year. We've been talking to them before we ended up signing with them. And we felt that they were the ones who really just supported our vision, who were completely unafraid to tackle the themes of the game, who really appreciated the characters we had, and who understood our vision for the game mechanics, which are definitely experimental, a lot of them, especially in terms of what we call weaponized words and the narrative combat in the game. So I think it was just basically a realization that, these guys get what we want to do. They support our vision. They're not gonna sort of interfere with that in any way. They're gonna be a partner, and that's what it is too. It's a partnership where they're co-funding the game, and we're still investing in it, and we still have our creative vision that we're going to carry through, but we get to increase the budget, and we get to sort of do everything we want to do with that game, and to have somebody who understands narrative games alongside, because they do. I mean, the Quantic Dream games are incredibly interesting in terms of doing new stuff and doing strange things with stories. I've always been fascinated with their games. Going back to the first game they did, the name escapes me right now, but the collaboration with David Bowie.
Nomad Soul.
Nomad Soul, exactly. Super interesting when I played that back in the day, and it felt like something completely new. So it was super exciting for us to find out that they were looking to sign games, and then to be able to draw on them as well, on their experience doing this for a very long time. I think that's going to be exciting.
I want to touch upon something that you sort of mentioned when we were talking about Journey. It's that you said that sort of games were sort of too big and complicated. I want to sort of ask how you sort of align that sort of vision and then put it into, the games you do at Red Thread, like Dustborn, and just sort of how you make a game that is very no, I don't know if I do, feel free to correct me here, but like more condensed, more of freely available to the player in terms of the time they put into it. Like, yeah, like talk to me about that. Like, just sort of how you sort of incorporate that vision into your own games.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the purposes of Red Thread Games was to be able to continue making single player games. Funcom was basically going completely towards multiplayer gaming. And it was not something I wanted to continue doing. I'd done it. It was fun. We did something new with the Secret World in terms of the massively multiplayer genre, but I wanted to get back to smaller games and shorter games and more focused experiences, and especially single-player experiences. So Dreamfall Chapters was supposed to be a 10-hour game. It turned into a 25 to 30-hour game, mostly because we felt we had a responsibility to telling this story, partly because the game was delayed and we basically decided to increase the scope of it to sort of reward our players and to bring everything to a proper conclusion for that saga. So it grew sort of threefold over the course of that development. But I don't think Dreamfall Chapters is not sort of the kind of game we necessarily wanted to continue making. So then we made Draugen, and Draugen is a game that is at most 4 hours long, and that was our first attempt at really doing something very focused and small in some ways, even though the game is ambitious. I mean, it's graphically it looks beautiful, and there's lots of stuff that we had to do from the ground up, you know, working with Unreal, doing the companion system. All of that was completely new to us, but that felt more like the kind of game we want to make, not in terms of, you know, being a first-person game or a game without any action, but just in terms of being a focused experience set in a completely new world with interesting characters that we wanted to explore and not sort of bound or anchored to anything that had existed before. So Dustborn is sort of the next step on that ladder, a game that's meant to be around 10 hours long. And I think that's for us the sweet spot. I think we all feel that, you know, a 3-4 hour game is interesting, but we want to tell stories that are more like a season of a TV show, dig deeper into lore, dig deeper into character. And 10 hours seems to me sort of the sweet spot between something that you can finish very quickly and a game that is, you know, sort of a long-term commitment. To me, 10 hours, yeah, that's a game I can finish. You know, I can't finish Assassin's Creed. I play them, but I get like a tenth of the way through them, and I'm like, okay, I don't have time for this anymore. So Dustborn and the games we intend to make in the future are meant to be more focused. They're meant to be more standalone. They allow us to explore new worlds and new themes without sort of being bound to something that we've done before or to player expectations. And it allows us to experiment with new gameplay mechanics, because we want to tell stories. That's what we want to do with our games, but that doesn't mean we're bound to a single game mechanic or a single genre. So with Dustborn, for example, we're doing action, we're doing combat, but we're doing our own narrative twist on that, which I can't talk about now, but it's something that we're going to be hopefully showing in the near future, where you look at it and you go like, yep, that's definitely Red Thread Games doing a thing, which is very different from what other studios would have done. It's a game about lots of words, and we're good at that. We're good at like putting lots of words into our games. So yeah, I mean, I think we have a sort of very clear idea of what we want to do and how we want to evolve, and that includes, you know, single player games, linear games in some way, but with what we call emotional branching, where people have some impact on the story, and games that explore storytelling in sort of that shape and form as sort of, you know, like the 10-hour standalone stories about interesting characters and interesting worlds.
And it's funny that you sort of mentioned that sort of seasonal TV show analogy. Like obviously there's, episodic stuff like The Walking Dead or anything Telltale put out before it closed, but also stuff like Life is Strange as well that sort of used the episodic model. But it's interesting that you specifically mentioned the sort of TV show seasonal aspect of it, because like the only other developer that has sort of used that reference is Remedy for the original Alan Wake. And I'm just sort of thinking aloud here in a way, but like, I guess what I'm trying to get at is what sort of drives you towards that sort of TV show sort of thinking for Dustborn?
Well, it's a great format, isn't it? Like, if I can sit down with a game that I know is not too long, that has a story that sort of takes you on a journey and to a conclusion, and that's divided into segments that allows me to play for 45 minutes, an hour, and at most an hour and a half in an evening. I think that is appealing to grown-ups, to people who don't have a wealth of free time, who can't necessarily commit to playing a ton or to play a single game for a very long time. I don't want to do that. A lot of people, they're bound to one game. They're sort of married to a game and they play that game for a month, 6 months, years sometimes. But to me, there's such a big audience for people like me who are like, you have a job, you have a family, you have maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours, at most 3 hours in an evening to do something. You're not just going to play games. You might watch an episode of Game of Thrones. You might actually spend some time with your family. You might play some Fortnite, and then maybe at the end of the evening you have 45 minutes. You can sit down and play part of a game on your own by yourself. A game that's not multiplayer, that doesn't require you to sort of team up with anybody or wait for somebody else, and something that allows you to have that sort of bite-sized entertainment, like a snack gaming. And that to me is the goal. So, with Dustborn, we're dividing it into sort of chapters, episode, issues, whatever you want to call it, and making sure that those are sized in a way that you can play for an hour in an evening, and then you can save, walk away from it, and maybe return to the game a week later to do the next bit of the game. I think there's a massive market for that. Games that just are more like dating than getting married. Assassin's Creed is a game about, now you get married to it, right? You have to commit to it. You have to learn the stuff, and then you have to do the stuff repeatedly over a long period of time. I think with Red Thread games, you can date them. You can go on a date in the evening and have fun, and then you can continue with a second date a week later, and that's fine.
I guess finally then on Dustborn, it's interesting that you mentioned how obviously the concept of it dates back to 2016 when basically the shit was hitting the fan with Trump being elected, Brexit and stuff like that there. Obviously now, 4 years later, like, things are changing. Like, yes, Brexit is still happening. It has happened in a way. We're just still in the transition period for another few weeks, and as we're recording this, the UK government and the EU are just basically trying to hash out the final aspects of a deal between both parties in terms of the divorce deal. And then obviously a month ago, Joe Biden wins the election. He'll be the next president, and bye bye the turnip, basically. I guess how much of sort of, obviously there is a lot of political leaning in that game, because obviously, like you say, you portray a sort of police state, very dystopian. You have a president for life. How do you sort of try and convey that now that there is that little bit of hope in the world again? Yes, we're going through a pandemic, obviously, but at the same time, we have a vaccine coming out for the COVID. Biden's coming in the office, and Brexit is, for better or worse, finally coming to an end. I guess, with a game like Dustborn, like considering when the concept was first originated, how do you put that game out there in the world now that there is, we were talking about that sort of aspect of, I think hope when we were talking about Journey. Like, how do you sort of put that game out there now? Like, how do you put out Dustborn in a world where it feels like the world is starting to sort of, albeit very, very slowly, start to reset?
I think this is the perfect opportunity for that, because I think in some ways, had Trump been reelected, had sort of we been facing another 4 years of the destruction of democracy, and it's not saying that it's not still happening. Of course it is, lots of places in the world, but I think it would have been hard to also play a game that reflects that and mirrors that in some way. So number one, I think it is a lot easier to get people to sort of appreciate this kind of fiction when there is hope in the world. I think that often goes for dystopian fiction. It's a lot easier to appreciate that when life is pretty good, and you can sort of have the dark dream of a world that is completely screwed up. But on another level, I mean, Dustborn is about hope. It is about a world that has been in the throes of fascism, of corporate domination, of a dictatorship. And then our characters are bringing hope into that world. It's about sort of taking a stand. It's about making the choice to fight for people rather than to just submit to what's there. So, I mean, in many ways, what's happening is exactly the right climate for the game. That's, of course, that's what we're hoping for on a personal level, but also on a purely sort of selfish level of, where, in what world do we want to release this game? It's perfect, because you know what? People are now hopefully more aware that it can happen anywhere. That if we don't fight for democracy, and we don't fight for diversity, if we don't fight for inclusiveness, and if we don't fight for others, then our world might crumble. It doesn't just happen in banana republics. It happens in America, it happens in Britain, it happens in Europe. It can happen anywhere, and it can happen quickly. And I think people are aware of that now, and they will be able to understand the game's world better and see that while, of course, we are a comic book reality and there are things in our world that are more fantastical, that it still sort of reflects a world that could have been, that could be, and that might be. And that brings it closer to home. I think, like, Americans, Europeans, at least those of us who've grown up in peace, we're coddled. We think like, yeah, shit happens somewhere in other countries and other continents, right? Like, but it doesn't happen to us. Well, I think it's obvious now that it can happen to us, and it still is happening to us. Fascism is still out there. Authoritarianism is still out there. People are, the rich are still trampling on the poor. There is a massive divide. And I think people are primed to fight now. And a game that's about sort of standing up and fighting, and about sort of hope in the face of darkness. I don't know. I think people are ready for that. Yeah, I think like if what I've said about Dustborn and about storytelling in general appeals to you, definitely check out Dustborn. You can go to wearedustborn.com or to redthreadgames.com to check out the teaser trailer and to read more about the game. And also, if you want to support our other games, check us out on Steam or on PlayStation and Xbox as well. And we have Dreamfall chapters out there and Draugen. And I would really encourage people to try Draugen. It's a game that flew under the radar of most people, I think, but it's a beautiful game in a 1920s coastal Norwegian setting with an amazing orchestral score by Simon Poole. That's won multiple awards, and that really sort of definitely 2/3 of that experience. As for myself, I mean, probably the best place to connect with me is on Twitter, where I'm at Ragso. I don't tweet enough. I'll try to remedy that, but if you want to know what's going on with Red Thread or my thoughts on various things, mostly game related, that's a good place to check me out.
Thanks for listening to My Favorite Game, a podcast by PlayDiaries.com where people in the games industry come on to talk of their favorite game. If you want to listen to future episodes of My Favorite Game or press play, please consider subscribing to our $2 tier on Patreon at patreon.com/playdiaries. Next week, Charlie Hodgson on The Sims. Until next week, bye bye.